This month, Jordy and I are talking about how Paul or Solomon or Jesus saw the world. And last week we both spoke about Paul. This morning I'm going to combine two, Solomon and Paul. We're going to look at two contrasting points of view toward the world. They, I think, are very different. And where they lead are very different. And therefore, where they end is very different. And so I hope that the walk through a few things in Ecclesiastes and the book of Philippians this morning will be beneficial for us. I think it's an important point of view that we who are trying to be spiritually minded in a material world really need to have in focus and stay sharp on. First of all, if I talk about a materialist can be one who, like the Sadducees, did not believe in angels, did not believe in the resurrection, did not believe in heaven, did not believe in hell. In fact, the material is the only reality. That doesn't go very far with most people. I'm not saying there aren't some who are that way, because there surely are. That reality is the only essence. Everything materially is the only reality. It is only what comes from your brain imagination, thinking, that is important. The second kind of materialist is someone who thinks that power and wealth and prestige, things like that, bring ultimate value. It's a point of view that sees the material as all important as opposed to the spiritual. All the values, all the energy, all the effort is invested in the material. And it's not that the materialist does not believe there is a God. It's not the materialist, you may say, is not religious. It's just that faith, which is a part of the individual who is a spiritual-minded person, is not the foundation. Solomon fits the second. Solomon is not the materialist in the sense that he does not believe there's a God. Solomon is an individual who believes there's a God, but his point of view of God is skewed from a materialist mindset. And it is that God gives us these material things, and then if we're not good boys and girls, God will take those material things away and give them to somebody else. And so really it's a comparison, a contrast rather, between a mindset that is focused on the material and a mindset that is focused on the spiritual. Now, when I talked about the appeal toward the material, wealth, comfort, possessions, we all want those things. And in fact, we find spiritually minded people in the Bible who were possessors of those things. The father of the faithful, Abraham, was a man who had much possessions. So I talk about the material and describing it that way. I'm not suggesting that the material in its proper place is improper, is incorrect. But with Solomon, the material was exaggerated. The material was the leading value. And faith in God was almost nil. And so what I want to do with you this morning is I just want to look at some things from the book of Ecclesiastes, and then we'll transition over to the book of Philippians. And I hope by the end of this I can put this together and it will make sense for you. So this morning we're going to talk about competing values. We're going to talk about the values of Solomon and the values of Paul, the values of the material versus the value of the spiritual. First of all, how did Solomon see the world? Solomon's point of view. Let's begin the book of Ecclesiastes. If you'd like to open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We're going to identify the way that Solomon comes to his conclusions. Look at verse 13. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly. Look at chapter 3. And look at verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. Do you see what I saw? Solomon is reaching his conclusions based upon what he saw. He'll further go on to say, as we'll explore in a moment, what I know, I made, I purposed, I perceived. Now, what Solomon is saying may be true, but notice, it is not the byproduct of revelation. It's the byproduct of what he saw. Look again in the book of Ecclesiastes, this time chapter 2 and verse 1. Notice what he says this time. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with myrrh. Therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely all this was vanity. Look at chapter 2 and verse 15. He says, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart. Did you get the import of what he's saying there? I said in my heart. This is not something he derived because of revelation from God. This was a conclusion that he's reaching because of what he said in his heart. In other words, what you find absent in Solomon's approach is the statement, thus saith the Lord. Contrast. Not asking you to turn there, just mentioning it. In the book of Ezekiel, prominent on every page in the book of Ezekiel, is thus the Lord said, or thus saith the Lord. You can't miss that what Ezekiel is talking about is not what he saw, not what he perceived, and not what he said. What Ezekiel talks about is what he received from the Lord. But notice Solomon's perspective is a byproduct of what he saw or what he said in his heart. Look again at chapter 2 and verse 14. Notice he says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. Look at chapter 3 and verse 12. He said, I know that it is better for them to rejoice and to do good in their lives. Notice in verse 14 he says, I perceive. In chapter 3 and verse 12 he says, I know. Now, what Solomon says in verse 14 when he says the wise man's eyes are in his head but the fool walks in darkness may be true. And what he's talking about there is here it's better to be a wise man than a fool. Well, that's absolutely true. But notice where he gets that. It's something he perceived. It's something he said, I know. Just passing through a few other passages before we focus our attention on one other element from Ecclesiastes. Solomon will go through the book, and in the book he will say, I have found one good man among 100, but I have not found one good woman among 1,000. Not a very flattering commentary, is it? How many wives and concubines combined did Solomon have? 1,000. And what he says is, out of 1,000 men, I might find one. Out of 1,000 women, I did not find one good one. Now, that might say that Solomon is a poor chooser of horseflesh, mixing metaphors there. I'm sure that's an analogy that women will appreciate. You think that here Solomon, why does he have these many wives? Well, a lot of the wives were wise because of political alliances. They were the results of treaties that were made. And so what you might think is that Solomon was a poor barterer, a poor tradesman, a horse trader with regard to the kind of treaty he's going to write, the kind of woman that he's going to get. But I don't think that's something that you want to camp on. That's an experience, and Solomon states it as a negative experience. I mean, do you want to follow a man who goes off the cliff? Do you want to follow a man who makes an absolute mess of his life? You want to follow a man who will say, it's better that to have death at an untimely place in your life? Better to be a dead man than a live man? Is that the kind of man you want to have? Those aren't things that are recommendable. Now, do we learn from those things? Yes. Do we need to learn those lessons? Yes. But they're lessons that are not learned from the positive. They're lessons that are learned from the negative. Now, can you learn lessons from the negative? You certainly can. But understand, the lessons that Solomon's talking about here, his point of view about life comes from what he perceived, what he knew, what he saw, what he understood. And there are a lot of areas I could go to illustrate this in the book of Ecclesiastes, but I'm going to take the one that stands out the most in the book to illustrate it. I'm going to take the idea of vanity. Because when Solomon begins the book, he talks about vanity and vexation. When he ends the book, he talks about vanity and vexation. In other words, all that he set out to experience, all that he saw, all that he knew, all that he made, all that he had, he said it begins with vanity and it ends with vanity. Now, we have to define what vanity is. Vanity is a word of futility. And what he's saying is life is utterly futile. In the beginning, I see that. In the end, I see that. Maybe a good illustration of that is like an air balloon. The air balloon is full of air. There's no substance to it whatsoever. You have this little bottle of soapy water, and it's got a stick in it with a hole in it. And you put that stick in, you pull it out, and you blow through that hole, and little bubbles go out. Kids just love to chase the bubbles. It's the best thing grandparents ever had to occupy children, especially when they're little, because you can blow the bubbles all day and they'll chase the bubbles all day. But when they reach out to catch the bubble, what do they have? Nothing. Nothing. Solomon said that's what this is. And furthermore, he would talk about it is grasping. The idea of grasping is he pursued it. He pursued this to grasp it. But he found out it was vanity and it was vexation. Look at a couple of passages that illustrate that from Solomon here. Look at chapter 1 and verse 2. He will say, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Look at verse 14. I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Look at chapter 2 and verse 11. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, on the labor in which I toiled. And indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Is that the point of view you want to have about what you've amassed, what you've accumulated, what you've built in your estate? That in the end, you look back at all this, and this was just, I reached out for it, and there was nothing of substance that was there. Especially when you look back at what he said, I acquired. And he said, all that I made and all that I acquired, in the end, he will say, he said it was nothing of profit. It was vanity and grasping out of the wind. Look again in the book. Look at chapter 4 and verse 8. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there's no end to all his labors. Nor is his eye satisfied with riches, but he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Here's a man who spends all of his days, all of his energy, all of his health, toiling, and never stops to ask, for whom am I toiling? Who's going to benefit from this? Who's going to drive any gain from this? Is that how we want to see what we do with our lives? If we look at our lives, don't we want to stop and say, all that I'm doing in my life, all the labor that I'm giving under the sun, I look at it and I never stop to ask for who benefits from this? No, we want to know who benefits. We want to know our children, our mates, our children, our grandchildren receive something from this. It's interesting that Solomon will say in the book of Proverbs, parents lay up for the children. Why do parents lay up for the children? Not the children for the parents. It's because the children are building something to give, to have for their children that is profitable, not something that is in the end toiling under the sun. Look again at what he will say in chapter 6 and verse 2. chapter 6 and verse 2. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it's an evil vexation. Does that have a lot of appeal? Here this man builds all of this. This man amasses all that he made, all that he acquired, all that he had. And in the end, he can't sit down and enjoy it. And in the end, it's given to a stranger to enjoy. He said, all this is vanity. Again, you look at chapter 2, and you see where he begins the pursuit. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with myrrh. Therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely there's also vanity. And Solomon will run the test through the book. He will talk about myrrh or pleasure. And in that he will talk about it's better to go to the day of mourning than to the day of feasting. Why? Because it's better to have a run on funerals? No. But because when there's one big party, nobody ever stops to contemplate about the seriousness of life and the meaning of life. One party after another that he could throw was just vanity. But when we go to the house of mourning, we at least for a moment are brought to our knees and pause to ask, what is the meaning of life? What's this life all about? And so Solomon will say it's better to go to the house of mourning. Look again at chapter 2 and verse 18. We'll read down through verse 26 this time. 2 and 18. Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all the labor in which I toiled, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Pause. Who do you think he's talking about there? Do you think he's looking out the window at Rehoboam? And he knows what a knucklehead Rehoboam is? He knows how little sense Rehoboam has? And what he knows is, I have spent my life, my father David spent all his life giving me this. I've spent all my life on the heels of my father David building this. And in the end, I'm going to die. And before my body's cold in the grave, this nitwit, this senseless son of mine, who has no ability whatsoever to run his life or much less to run a nation, is going to ruin the whole thing. He labored for none of this. And what happened? Sure enough, Rehoboam made a choice that split the nation. Continue on, verse 20. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor which I had toiled under the sun. For there's a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill. Yet he must leave heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what is man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, with which he toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. Nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This I also saw was from the hand of God. Who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Do you see what Solomon's saying there? Again, I spent all my life toiling and laboring. And again, I leave it to one who has not labored a bit for it, and all the days are sorrowful. Is that how you want to look at your estate? Is that how you want to look back at your life whenever you hand the keys to the estate to your children or your grandchildren? That you know when you've done that, this is nothing but sorrowful, and you know that if they don't do good with it, God will take it away and give it to someone else. Not a high recommendation of Solomon. Look again at chapter 4. Look at verse 4. And again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Here a man is skilled, and the best he can get from his neighbor is the fact that his neighbor envies him. Look again at verse 8. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there's no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches, but he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Who am I building this for? Where's all this going to go? He says in the end, it's vanity. Look again at chapter 5 and verse 10. Chapter 5 and verse 10. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, or he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Look at chapter 6 and verse 11 and 12. Chapter 6, verse 11 and 12. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man to do better? For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen to him under the sun? Did you get that? For what good is man in life all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell? Who can tell a man what will happen under the sun? Again, not a recommendation about life. And then finally, turn to chapter 11 and look at verse 7. In chapter 11 and verse 7 here, Solomon begins to think about the young versus the old. And in verse 7 he said, truly the light is sweet, and it's pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But then notice verse 10. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your eyes, for childhood and youth are vanity. Do you get that? Light is sweet and pleasant for the eyes, but look, you better enjoy the days of your youth because there are dark days coming. And there are going to be many of those dark days. You better take in all the days of your youth you have, because one day the dark days are going to come, and it's hard to be old. It's difficult. It's challenging to be. Being old is not for sissies, someone said. And Solomon said, you better enjoy those days of your youth, because the days are going to come that are going to be many. They're going to be hard. And all that you built, all you attained, all you spent your health for, you're now going to spend your wealth for to save your health. The dark days are going to be many. And then he goes on in chapter 12 to describe the debilitation that age brings on an individual, and then closes the book by saying, vanity and vexation of spirit. It's all grasping after the wind. In the end, what has this life under the sun meant and produced? Does that leave you feeling pretty good about your life? Does that leave you feeling pretty good about your heirs, about your children, your grandchildren that you have or are to come? Well, I don't know about you, but that's pretty pessimistic. And I would suggest to you that's not the point of view we want to have in life. So I want to consider Paul's point of view. And I want you to turn with me to the book of Philippians for this. The book of Philippians. First of all, I want you to notice how Paul will begin. Look at chapter 1 and verse 4. Look at verse 3 and 4. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making requests for you with joy. Look at verse 18. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. In this I rejoice, and yes, will rejoice. Did you hear that kind of language in what we read from Ecclesiastes? Not at all. Paul here begins to talk about his relationship with the Philippians, his relationship with the church here. And the first thing he says to them is, I rejoice over you. Look at chapter 2 and begin with verse 2. Notice what he will say. Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and one mind. Wait a minute. What did Solomon say about people? I work hard all my day. I can't enjoy it. And a stranger sits at my table. I got this kid out here I'm raising, and he knows straight up from backwards. He has no sense whatsoever, and he's going to ruin everything I've built. There's no joy in the life that Solomon has. Okay, he will mention it a couple of times. For example, he will talk about rejoice in the wife of your youth, but then he goes on to describe her. And I'm not sure that's going to be something you're going to put on an anniversary card. Might get thrown back at you. But notice how he begins to talk about them. Look at chapter 2, verse 16 through 18. Holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Yes, and if I'm poured out as a drink offering of the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason you also be glad and rejoice with me. Does Paul mention the word vain? Yes. But how does he use it? That I've not labored in vain. I've spent my life, I'm pouring my life out for you, and I'm pouring my life out for the strength of your faith, for the sacrifice of your soul, for service unto you, and I don't regard that as something that is grasping after the wind. Notice again in chapter 2, in verses 28 and 29. Therefore, I send him the more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all the gladness, and hold such men in esteem. How's Paul regard Epaphroditus here? He sees him highly. He says you regard him, you receive him what? With joy. You don't receive him understanding, okay, he has something, he didn't labor for it, he's going to ruin it, or he's laboring all of his day and never stops to ask, who's this for? Paul has invested himself in Epaphroditus, and he has invested himself in these Philippians, and he says, I say rejoice in this. Rejoice is not the theme of Philippians. It's a keynote word. Commitment is the theme of Philippians. It's a commitment to the Lord that is the key. Look again at chapter 3, verse 1. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord, for to me to write same things to you is not tedious for you, but is safe. Look at verse 3. For we are the circumcision who worship God in spirit, rejoice in Christ, and have no confidence in the flesh. Wait a minute. Have no confidence in the flesh? Where was Solomon's confidence? In what I saw, what I perceived, what I made, what I acquired, what I understood. And Paul says, have no confidence in the flesh. Look at chapter 4. Chapter 4. Look at verses 1 through 4. Therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, beloved. I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind of the Lord, and I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labor with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I will say, rejoice. Look at what he will say in verse 6 and verse 10. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. In verse 10, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did not care, but you have lacked opportunity. Do you see Paul's point of view here? If we took the time to thread through the book and we dealt with the idea of peace. In fact, he begins the book this way, verse 2, grace to you and peace from God our Father. Chapter 2, verse 1, therefore, if any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection, fulfill my joy. Comfort, peace. Solomon's agitated. Solomon's stirred. Solomon never finds the rest. Here he sets his table, and there are so many people at the table, he doesn't know who's at the table. And he can't even take the time to sit at the table and eat himself. That's not Paul. Now, let's ask a few questions here. When you look at this from Paul, who's in the picture? The people at Philippi, the church there. And what does he say about them? Translating from the book of Ricky, what he says is, I love you folks. I'm so thankful for you. I take great courage from you. I've invested my life in you, and you have responded in kind. What were his circumstances? Was he in the palace? Was he ruling kingdoms? Was he amassing servants? Was he acquiring wealth? Was he building water gardens? Where's he at? He's in prison. Well, what about his needs? Solomon said, I need nothing. I got it all. Queen of Sheba comes and she said, I haven't been told about this man. This guy has wealth that would make Bill Gates look like a pauper. And yet Paul says, all the needs that I have, you have met. And I have learned, in whatever state I'm in life, whether I got a bunch or whether I got little, I can abound and I can thank God. Now, I want to ask us, which one of those mindsets do we want? Which attitude toward life do we want? Do we want an attitude toward life that when we look at life, we say, all this vain life, Have you ever become discouraged and down and distraught about life? I mean, life under the sun gets heavy, right? The news is so filled with all this gobbledygook and junk nonsense that takes place. Is that all there is to life? Paul said, no. There's so much more to it. And listen, when you read chapter 3, Paul was a wealthy man. And Paul said all this wealth in the end meant absolutely nothing to me, that I may be found in Christ, that I may know him and the fellowship of his suffering. When you walk with Paul, no person's life ends in failure. When we walk with Solomon, life is one perplexing frustration after another. Do you see what I said at the beginning? There are two different mindsets. They lead two different paths, and they end in two different ways. One leads to real satisfaction and peace. The other to disappointment and emptiness. You see what we have in Christ? You see why what we do here is important? You take all this away. Because in the end, there's no resurrection. We are the most pitiable people there are, Paul will say. Because we could have been out here having one grand time, racking up our estate, building our lives up with life under the sun, and then when we would be dead, we'd be like Rover, we'd be dead all over, and that would be the end of it. The grave is it. No one who walks with Paul in the end says, my life was filled with pursuing empty bubbles. One who walks with Paul understands what real life is about. That's the perspective we want. We want that perspective about each other, about people. We want that perspective about our circumstances. And want that perspective about how our needs are satisfied. The psalmist said, I have been young and I have been old. I've never seen the righteous hungry nor the seed begging bread. Never seen the righteous hungry nor the seed begging bread. I'll tell you what. When you find out there's a need, you better jump on the care calendar quick here, because if you don't, you blink an eye, you'll not have a chance to feel it. Why? Because God's people provide for his people. That's why. But not Solomon. He can't even sit at the table and enjoy it. Now the question comes down for me and you. Not just now, because we're talking about it, but going forward in our pursuit of life. Will we press toward the mark and that be our pursuit? Or will we pursue the grasping after the wind? Powerful, powerful consider. If there's something we can do this morning to help you, if you're watching us virtually and you need to go to your closet and pray, then by all means do that. If we can help you this morning in some way, we want to do that. And you come while we stand and while we sing.